We're really very fortunate here for your luncheon conversation. I know I have to disrupt here. You're going to continue, I know, to have camaraderie throughout the day and beyond. But we were now going to turn to a very important part of our program. First, we're going to hear from our Provost, Jim Bean, here at Northeastern University. And he, in turn, is going to introduce our luncheon keynote, Admiral Doug Fears. And so really thrilled first to have my Provost. As we mentioned at the outset, the Global Resilience Institute is a university-wide effort, so it involves all 9 of our colleges. That actually requires the boss who oversees all those colleges, as well as the deans, many of whom are here, decide this is a good idea. And so I really feel blessed that I have the academic leadership, senior academic leadership here at Northeastern University, who's really embraced interdisciplinary research and education as key. It's really part of the DNA already of Northeastern. This just gives us a platform to do around resilience. So with that, I'm going to turn now to Provost Bean. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Steve. It's great to be here and see how successful this first research summit is kicked off. Thank you for traveling from as far away as New Zealand and Australia, China, and India, Iraq, and Europe, Chile, and Canada to help launch the Global Resilience Research Network. In our hyper-connected world, there are local shocks that can have global consequences, where the risks associated with man-made and naturally occurring disruptive events are shared by us all. This gathering of so many of the world's leading experts in resilience could not be more timely. Northeastern University is honored to host this summit. Founded in 1898, Northeastern is evolved from a local university to a truly global one, and a leader in experiential learning. Today we offer students opportunities for professional work, research, service, and learning in 133 countries on 7 continents. Yes, we do research in Antarctica. Our solutions-focused research enterprise is strategically aligned with 3 global imperatives: health, security, and sustainability. I might note that resilience is important to all 3 of those. Northeastern offers undergraduate and graduate degrees in 9 colleges and schools and select advanced degrees at graduate campuses in Seattle, Silicon Valley, Toronto, and Charlotte, North Carolina. And I should add that we will very soon be adding substantial undergraduate content to those campuses as well. Our 2025 academic plan embraces and advances Northeastern's strengths in providing globally networked learning and experiences, and our international commitment to interdisciplinary research that can make meaningful contributions to health security and sustainability. Last year, we launched the Global Resilience Institute under the leadership of Steve Flynn as a university-wide research enterprise on recognition that informing and advancing individual, community, system, and societal resilience requires interdisciplinary collaboration and innovative global thinking. We also need to be externally focused so as to connect our researchers and students with industry, governments, NGOs, and experts in devising real-world solutions that can be scaled to meet a truly global imperative. The stakes could not be higher. As we heard this morning from an extraordinary panel of seasoned practitioners who have led efforts to deal with major disasters and acts of terrorism, and the panels this afternoon will discuss meeting the resilience imperative and will require greater degrees of risk literacy and education, new designs at the macro and micro levels, and the incentives and governance for adopting these designs and supporting decisions to allow for the rapid advancement of resilience in the face of global turbulence. There could be no better bridge between this morning's discussion and this afternoon's program than the luncheon speaker I am honored to introduce. Admiral Doug Fears currently serves as Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and as Senior Director for Resilience Policy at the National Security Council in the White House. In this capacity, he is responsible for coordinating policy across a broad range of resilience, response, and preparedness policies. Over this past year, There has been no shortage of major disasters to reinforce the importance of the role that Doug has been playing. Major hurricanes, winter nor'easters, wildfires, mudslides, and mass shootings have been very much in the headlines and have disrupted millions of lives and generated record economic losses. Admiral Fears has over 3 decades of policy, budget, legislative, foreign affairs, interagency, and operations experience. He's also served at sea aboard 8 ships around the world and is commanding officer of 3. Most recently, he served as Chief of Staff for the Coast Guard's Atlantic Area Command, overseeing operations from the Great Lakes, Western Rivers, Gulf of Mexico, south through Central and South America, and eastward through Europe and Africa to the Arabian Gulf. That kind of sounds like the whole world. Between seagoing assignments, he served as the Chief of Law Enforcement for the Coast Guard, the White House Director for Central America and the Caribbean on the National Security Council staff, the Coast Guard's liaison to the U.S. House of Representatives, and has overseen the support for counterterrorism and law enforcement programs at Coast Guard headquarters. Admiral Fears, we are honored that you have taken the time from your demanding schedule to travel to Boston and help launch the Global Resilience Research Network. We look forward to hearing your comments.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Greetings from Washington. I'll admit up front that they don't let me out of my office often. So thank you, Steve, for the invitation and the great excuse to come listen to some of the smartest minds in resilience work. I looked last night as I checked into my hotel room at the notes my staff had suggested for me, and I discarded them around 10 o'clock. So I took a few notes and thought I'd just tell you some stories about what we've been through from a U.S. perspective in this really disastrous year in terms of natural disasters and other emergencies. So before I start, I'm gonna explain to you a little bit about the National Security Council staff and how we're organized to help you understand our perspective on this. The National Security Council, by definition, is a policy coordinating body. And so in that regard, we coordinate across U.S. departments and agencies for federal policy. I chair the Domestic Resilience Group, which is a body of approximately 35 different departments and agencies. On one end of the spectrum, we have the Department of Defense, and probably on the other end of the spectrum, the Postal Inspection Service, and everything in between. So I find myself talking to the Department of Health and Human Services and Housing and Urban Development and some of those spaces a little bit more often than I would have predicted. But that's all meaningful work in the global resilience context. So under me, it's a fairly flat organization. I'm the Senior Director for Resilience Policy. And I have a series of directors that work for me that coordinate at their levels across the interagency. And I have a director for continuity policy. So if you think continuity of government, continuity of the presidency, those sorts of things. I have a director for energy sector resilience, and she's detailed to us from the Department of Energy. I have a director for preparedness policy. I have a director for risk mitigation policy. A director for critical infrastructure policy, a director for medical preparedness policy, a director for plans and exercises policy, a director for response policy, and because of the year of our Lord 2017, I created a director for recovery policy because that's a big part of what the federal government's doing to support state and local recovery from these disasters. And so for our colleagues, our international colleagues that might not have looked at the aggregate of disasters together, we've had a number of major wildfires, but the 2 wildfires in California, the Northern California wildfires were the most destructive economically in the history of the state of California. And then the Southern California wildfires covered the most acreage in the history of the state of California at around 280,000 280,000 acres. And then, of course, we had, you heard the judge speak earlier about Harvey coming ashore in Texas. And, sir, I can remember the day sitting at my desk when I got the 11 o'clock report. It had been forecast to be a tropical storm up to that point. And in one single forecast, it said it was coming ashore as a Cat 3. And I called my team together quickly, and I said, clear your schedules for the next 2 weeks. Because our policy coordinating work essentially stops at that point. The White House, for those of you who are familiar with the organization of it, doesn't really have an operational arm. The departments and agencies are those operational arms. But to maintain situational awareness for the president and the senior staff, and to make sure that we don't have a bunch of senior folks from the White House going out in 27 different directions, we coordinated all of that internally. Working up to the president, and we coordinated all of that down out of the White House to departments and agencies and to the affected governors in this case. And so as we went through Harvey, our little staff of 10 of us turned into a little 24/7 situational awareness operation, looking, of course, for where there might be gaps in existing policy or gaps in existing authorities, which is kind of the value proposition, if you will, of the NSC. If we identify those gaps, we can work on closing those gaps so that as we're challenged in response initially and then recovery over the longer term, we can make that exercise of federal authority and power a little bit more efficient. In terms of numbers, I had some statistics here that in 2017, 8% of Americans were impacted by disaster of one form or another. It's 26 million people. Hurricanes, wildfires, mudslides. You've heard those statistics. And so one of the things that we did as we got into the storm season. And I will say candidly that I'm really, as terrible as these were and as devastating as they were, I'm really glad that they didn't happen in the reverse order of Maria, Irma, and then Harvey, because I think we would have been deeply challenged as a federal government to be able to respond to and recover from those things. With the destruction that Harvey brought, with the destruction that Irma brought, what Maria leveled on the island of Puerto Rico was truly, truly devastating. And one of my colleagues said to me while we were in the middle of it that it was almost like Puerto Rico was being taken back to the year 1880 with no notice, complete loss of power. And some of the challenges that we faced were really illustrative and I think informative for this group of people that contemplate resilience. We've become so dependent on communications that are dependent on voice over internet protocol, satellite technology, the Internet of Things, all these different ways that we do business, pulling out our PDAs and being able to email back and forth. And so one of the things that was most troubling from the initial outset of Maria's impact on Puerto Rico was that we couldn't communicate around the island. We didn't know there's 78 municipalities around the island. And so one of the first mission assignments that FEMA had to push out early on was to get satellite telephones flying by helicopter all around the island and drop them off so that people could communicate and say, I'm okay. Don't quote me on the number. I think there are 69 or 68 hospitals on the island of Puerto Rico. The number of medical devices that are dependent on the internet, that are dependent on electricity, not only in the hospital environment, but also in the residential environment as you start to try and triage the people that need response assistance most urgently. And I would have never guessed that one of the first decisions that we had to make was how are we going to get cash down to the island? So working with the Department of Treasury's operations branch, there was about $250 million loaded onto pallets and stuck in an airplane and flown to San Juan. And so we're talking about taking all this cash to Puerto Rico so that they can transact, because all of the ATMs were down and bank services were down. Your ability to communicate and transfer funds were down. At the same time, the debris removal mission, critical in the early stages. We could get all the commodities we needed to into the ports around Puerto Rico, but we couldn't distribute them through the island. And most people who haven't visited Puerto Rico, I've probably been there 50 or 60 times over my time, and I was just there this past week. Most people think it's all beaches and sunshine and all that sort of thing, but it's a very mountainous island. And so when the power lines went down across the island, that effort is still ongoing. I think that they're at about 95% power recovery at this point. As we flew across the transmission lines on the island, the thing that just floored me was that every element of putting new transmission lines up across the mountain were all done by helicopter. Areas that are so remote that you have to drop in towers and drop in people and drop in bulldozers and forklifts and those sorts of things to be able to move things around. And then as they get the transmission lines up, you actually pull the power lines by helicopter. And so we flew over probably somewhere between 30 and 50 miles of transmission lines through the mountains of Puerto Rico. So tremendous challenge, but I think that as we continue to work through that recovery, and we will be for easily a decade in my mind, as we begin to rebuild and restore and to do all those things, the challenge of resilience, right, is all these interdependencies we've been talking about, so that as you recover and as you rebuild, have you planned to do that? And the way the federal programs are designed in the U.S. government, the Federal Highways Administration, for example, will grant money to go down and rebuild roads. Well, are the highways guys thinking about what the fiber optic underlays under a corridor of highway, or a node for water delivery, or those sorts of things? This really goes back to the need to plan for your worst day and to plan how you're going to recover. And in particular, the one thing I heard earlier with respect to mitigating risks is trying to eliminate and invest in ways that you eliminate repetitive loss. And so with the change in the climate, with some of the things that we've seen over time with respect to floodplains, why should you rebuild in a floodplain when it's only going to come flood again at some point? And then you get into this series of repetitive loss. And we've seen that in the United States in a number of places. In fact, I remember reading an article in the Washington Post back in August about the National Flood Insurance Program and repetitive loss in particular. And there was a couple that was profiled that had lived in the same house for 25 years. And their home had been flooded. And of course, you can't sell a home that's in a floodplain, right? So they had to stay there. They couldn't afford to move somewhere else. And so there was no federal program to just buy their home and raise it and say nobody can build there again. And so they get individual assistance after the flood event, and then they rebuild, and then they get flooded again, and then they rebuild, and then they get flooded again, and then they rebuild. When a better expenditure of federal dollars would be to, probably just buy the property, raise it, and so you can't build there anymore. So as we think through some of these things, I think these are the challenges for us in the resilience space, because when we recover from disasters, we need to be mindful that these are some of the challenges that if we don't make it better, then we'll be dealing with it again. And the estimated costs of the disasters of 2017, I'm told, are around $300 billion. We've heard there are many mitigation studies that tell you for every dollar spent in mitigation, you can save anywhere from $3 to $8, I think I've seen, in recovery costs. And so even if you believe it's a 1 in 3 ratio, instead of spending $300 billion, we could have spent $100 billion recovering from this season of disaster. And so those are our challenges. And you know that from a technological perspective and scientific and practical perspective, perhaps better than I do. The other thing that was really unique about Puerto Rico in this case is, as we walked through beginning to recover and to respond to the disasters in all these different places, the mutual assistance, the ability for power line trucks, for example, to come into Florida after Irma, they came from all over the United States. I think all 50 states had contributed to, and the government of Canada had contributed line trucks. 60,000 line trucks came to Florida. You couldn't have the same sort of thing in Puerto Rico because it was 1,000 miles away and everything has to get loaded onto a barge and taken down there or loaded into the back of a big transport plane. So these are our challenges, and I'm going to end on this one note. I was in Puerto Rico last week, spent a couple days all over the island seeing the different recovery projects that were underway. But as we were in this town, Utuado, we had landed on a Customs and Border Patrol aircraft in the baseball field there. And these boys came out of the community to come see the helicopters. And as we were I was with my boss, Tom Bossert, and as we were coming back to the helicopter, these boys were running away, and he called them back and said, "Hey, why don't you come, let's get some pictures, and you can see the helicopter," because they were 7, 8-year-old boys. And this boy came up and he tugged on Tom's coat, and he asked to pray for him. And Tom knelt in front of this boy, and this boy put his hand on Tom's head, and he said a prayer in Spanish. And I got to tell you, as you can hear in my voice, I was deeply moved by that. Individual resilience. Turns out this boy was homeless. He had been taken in by an older gentleman, and he was just grateful. He was grateful that we were there to help. But he had picked himself up and really recovered personally. And so those are our challenges, and that's, I guess, my perspective from my perch, but I'm getting the hook here. So let me stop there, and Steve, turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Doug, for that. And, we keep coming back, of course, that it's ultimately about real individuals, real people, and you finished that. So our focus often in academia, particularly those involved with systems design and so forth, we sometimes lose sight of that this is really something that can be impactful on individual lives. And so this is important work. It's urgent work.